Get her out of the frame. Burton Ashby, 67-year-old founder of Ashby Development Group, said it the way he said most things, quietly, without turning his head, as though the instruction were obvious and the delay in following it was the only impolite thing happening in the room. Joelle Merritt Ashby, 33-year-old wife of Grant Ashby, heard it clearly. The photographer paused. The cluster of executives and family members around her shifted the way people shift when they are trying to create a gap without acknowledging they are creating one. The photograph was meant to commemorate the groundbreaking of Harwick Tower, a 12-story mixed-use development in downtown Hartford that the Ashby family had spent 3 years positioning as the centerpiece of Grant's succession from his father. Behind the assembled group, a polished architectural rendering filled the wall. Beneath it, Ashby Development Group. The next generation begins here. Joelle's name appeared nowhere on it. Gloria Ashby, 63-year-old wife of Burton, smiled from the front row with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment for 6 years. You can stand with the consultants, darling. This is really for the leadership team. Grant Ashby, 39-year-old executive vice president of Ashby Development and Joelle's husband, had already looked away. He was adjusting his cufflinks and watching the photographer reset the frame. And Britta Crane, 31-year-old director of business development at Ashby, had already moved into the space beside him with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing it. Joelle stepped back. She had grown expert at stepping back. She stood near the side wall of Thornfield House's grand reception room, the Ashby family estate in Litchfield County, Connecticut, where Burton and Gloria had hosted every significant company event for 30 years, and she watched the group arrange themselves around her husband as though she had never been part of the composition at all. What none of them understood, standing beneath the restored plasterwork ceiling of a room partly renovated with money that did not belong to them, was that the building behind them, Harwick Tower, sat on land leased entirely from Merritt Capital Properties. And Merritt Capital Properties belonged to Joelle. Not to a minor inheritance, not to a small family portfolio. To her, through the Merritt Holdings structure her father, Elias Merritt, had spent 30 years building before he died quietly, without ever needing strangers to recognize his name. Elias had never appeared in a photograph either. That had been a choice. 14 months before the Thornfield celebration, Joelle had received a call at 2 a.m. from her father's former chief financial officer. Ashby Development's primary lender had issued a notice of default. The company had 30 days to cure $22 million in outstanding obligations before acceleration of its remaining debt. If that happened, 417 employees would face layoffs before the new year. Grant came home after midnight and sat at the kitchen table without speaking for nearly an hour. When Joelle brought him tea he didn't want, he finally looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had run out of plans. "I don't know if we can fix this one," he said. He was asleep in the chair by 3. She covered him with a blanket, went to the back bedroom, and called her attorney. Maud Ellery, 48-year-old legal counsel, and one of 3 people who knew what Joelle actually controlled, had the preliminary structure drafted by 5 a.m. By the following Tuesday, Merritt Capital Properties had quietly acquired controlling interests in Ashby Development's primary commercial leases and injected emergency capital through a structured facility that cured the default, funded contractor arrears, and kept payroll intact through the end of the fiscal year. Burton Ashby announced at his club that the company had been stabilized through a strategic partnership with an institutional investor. He accepted handshakes. He told his board the fundamentals had always been sound. He never asked the investor's name. Grant told Joelle the company had been saved by an outside capital group. He said it with the relief of a man who had narrowly missed something terrible. He never noticed her face. Elias had warned her about that kind of blindness. People see what they expect to see. He had told her once, during a real estate dispute between 2 of his senior partners. When they expect nothing from you, they will look directly at what you've built and call it empty space. The affair was not a surprise by the time Joelle confirmed it. It arrived the way most slow disasters do, as a pattern rather than a moment. She found the first indication in September. A corporate car service receipt for a site visit to Providence listed 2 passengers. Grant had told her he was going alone. The second name on the receipt was Britta Crane. She told herself it could mean something innocent. She had made that kind of allowance before. The hotel documentation arrived in October, forwarded by Drummond Sy, 54-year-old independent director on Merritt Capital's board, who had been quietly auditing Ashby Development's executive expenses as part of a routine compliance review. Grant and Britta had shared a suite at the same Boston hotel on 4 separate occasions. Each trip had been classified under business development travel and approved through the company's executive budget. Drummond's email contained a single line beneath the attachment. "You should see this before anyone else does." Joelle read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and sat in her car in a parking garage for 20 minutes. Because she did not want to go home until she could control her expression. She did not confront Grant. She needed the whole picture before she moved, and she needed to be honest with herself about what she was looking for: a reason to stay or the courage to leave. Her father had taught her that decisions made inside a fresh wound were the most expensive kind. She decided she would go to Thornfield. She would watch Grant one last time in the room that belonged to his family and see whether any part of the man she had loved in the early years still existed in the man who stood before her now. If it did, she would find a way to speak honestly. If it did not, at least she would know. She knew within the first 10 minutes. The group photograph told her what she needed. The dinner confirmed it. Gloria had arranged the seating herself. Joelle's place card sat between a junior contractor and an empty chair. Britta sat 2 places to Grant's left and leaned toward him when he spoke, and laughed at the right moments with the ease of someone who had memorized his rhythm. Burton raised a glass and spoke about Grant's readiness to lead, about the kind of family and institution needed behind it, steady, worthy of the name on the buildings, and looked directly past Joelle as though she were seated at the wrong table. After dinner, Joelle found Grant on the side terrace. She had meant to ask about the hotel records calmly. What came out was simpler. "How long?" He looked at the garden. "It's not what you're imagining. I have the car service records and the expense invoices from your own system." His silence ran about 4 seconds. "It's complicated." "It isn't," she said. "What's complicated is why you invited me here tonight." He looked through the French doors at the room where his family was still celebrating. "My father wants to announce the succession plan before the year is out. He thinks it should be clean, settled." Well looked at him steadily. "Settled. I didn't want to do it this way." "Then don't." He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided to sacrifice. "I need the company," he said. "I've worked for it my whole life." She understood. He had not invited her to Thornfield to repair anything. He had invited her because Coleman Rich, 57-year-old Ashby family attorney, was waiting inside with papers, and Burton had determined that witnesses made the ending cleaner, controlled. No room for Joelle to reframe it. She walked back inside. The leather folder on the side table had a yellow sticker with her name printed on it. Coleman stood beside the fireplace. Burton called for quiet in the way he always did, without raising his voice. "Grant has decided to pursue a separation," Burton said. "The terms are straightforward and were drafted to protect both families." Gloria stood beside him. Britta remained near the hallway with her arms folded. Joelle looked at her husband. "You could have told me this at home." "We wanted to ensure it was handled properly," Gloria said. "Properly for whom?" No one answered. Coleman opened the folder. The room waited. Joelle thought about the night 14 months earlier. Grant asleep in the kitchen chair, his face slack with exhaustion and fear. Her sitting at her desk at 4 in the morning, authorizing $22 million to protect his family's employees and his father's legacy, and the man she believed her husband still was. She had not done it expecting a return. She had done it because she loved him, and because 400 families deserved better than to pay for the Ashby family's mismanagement. She thought about all of that while Grant picked up the pen. She did not ask him to stop. She had made herself one promise before she walked into Thornfield. She would leave knowing she had given him every honest chance to choose differently. He was answering that question right now, without knowing it was being asked. Grant signed the petition and the proposed settlement. The scratch of a pen across paper has no particular sound, but Joelle heard it clearly. She set her house key on the table beside the folder. She looked at Grant for a moment, not at his parents, not at Britta, not at Coleman, just at him. Then she walked out of Thornfield House through the front entrance and did not look back at the restored plasterwork ceiling, or the clean white terrace, or any of the things that had been paid for with money that was never the Ashby family's to spend. Bex, Joelle's executive assistant and one of 4 people who knew her employer's full identity, was waiting at the end of the Thornfield driveway in a dark blue SUV. She didn't speak until they had cleared the property gates. Then quietly, "Are you hurt?" "Not the way they intended," Joelle said. Maud Ellery arrived at the Merit Capital apartment in Hartford within the hour. She read the divorce petition and settlement at the kitchen table while Joelle sat across from her with both hands around a mug she wasn't drinking from. The settlement preserves separate property on both sides, Maud said. Premarital holdings, inherited assets, anything held in trust. Coleman drafted it specifically to wall off the Ashby family from whatever you might own. She looked up over her reading glasses. He walled off everything you have from Grant. Joelle almost smiled. The family is also preparing a public succession announcement, Maud continued. Grant as incoming CEO. The framing references his leadership during a challenging capital period. That's the rescue. They're going to claim credit for surviving it. They already have privately. Maud closed the folder. The question is whether they say it publicly. Joelle set down the mug, then we proceed. The Merit Capital Board had been briefed. Drummond and Maud had prepared the disclosure package and the compliance review of Ashby Development's executive expense accounts. The one that had been running quietly for 6 weeks had produced documentation that the independent board would not be able to look past. Thornfield's East Wing renovation, the one with the imported marble and the rebuilt terrace where Burton held his summer dinners, had been invoiced to Ashby Development under a maintenance contract that did not exist. Britta's out-of-state travel, 18 months of it, had been classified under client entertainment. Grant's hotel stays, a piece of jewelry purchased in November through the company's client appreciation account, 14 after-hours visits to the executive suite at the Alderman Hotel in Hartford. All of it documented, time-stamped, and signed by people who had assumed no one would ever look. It was not Merit Capital's job to prosecute any of it. That was for the independent board once the documentation was in front of them. Joelle's role was simply to be honest about who she was. Everything else would follow on its own. The Harwick Tower signing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the downtown offices of Harwick Partners, the development group funding the project. It was the largest transaction in Ashby Development's history. Burton had already told the trade press an announcement was coming. Grant's team had rehearsed the handshake photographs. What neither of them knew was that Harwick Partners had sold its equity position in the development site 6 weeks earlier. The buyer was Merit Capital Properties. Joelle was already seated at the conference table when the Ashby group arrived. She sat at the far end with Maud and Drummond beside her. The Merit Capital team lined the left side of the room. The table was clean and quiet and had the particular stillness of a space where something final was about to happen. Burton entered first. Grant followed in a charcoal suit. Coleman carried a briefcase. Britta entered last, already looking at her phone, dressed for a photograph. The room stopped making sense to them at approximately the same moment. Burton's eyes moved from Joelle to the Merit Capital placards on the table. Grant's face went through several expressions with no place to land. Britta looked at the company name printed on the presentation folder in front of her and did not move. Joelle said, "Good morning." Burton's voice when he found it was careful. "What is this?" Drummond opened a folder. Merit Capital Properties acquired the Harwick development site 6 weeks ago. We are the counterparty on this transaction. He turned a page. We are also the controlling lessor on Ashby Development's headquarters building, your Hartford showroom complex, your Bridgeport staging facility, and the 3 development parcels you have had under option since last spring. The silence had weight. Your Merit Capital, Grant said. He wasn't asking. Merit Capital is mine, Joelle said. Through the structure my father built. He died 4 years ago. I've controlled it since. Grant was very still. She watched him pull the pieces together slowly, the way she had watched him work through other difficult truths, with the specific discomfort of a person who has built an entire understanding of a situation and is now being asked to dismantle it. The rescue, 14 months ago. I authorized it the morning after you told me. The company was in default. You were asleep in the kitchen. I didn't tell you, because I needed to know who you were without knowing what I had. I needed that to be real. Burton's voice came back sharp. You had no right to acquire our assets without disclosure. I acquired a position in your leases on terms your company agreed to. I am disclosing now. Joelle looked at Drummond. Drummond placed a second folder in front of Burton, the compliance summary, the East Wing renovation, the entertainment invoices, the hotel records, the executive suite access logs. Burton read the first page and stopped reading. The independent board has received the same documentation, Maud said. They convene Monday. Gloria, who had entered quietly behind the group and was standing near the door, put one hand flat against the wall. You paid for the Thornfield renovation with your own company's money, Joelle said. She said it the way you name a coordinate. This is where we are. Not an accusation, a fact. Burton looked at her for a long moment. The anger was still there, but beneath it something else had appeared. She recognized it. It was the look of a man who has just understood how long he has been standing on ground that was never his. What do you want? He asked. I want the independent board to follow the evidence without interference. I want Ashby Development's employees to keep their jobs, their benefits, and their pensions, which were in danger 14 months ago and are now secured through Merit Capital's lease structure. She gathered her papers and stood. What I want for myself doesn't belong in this room. Grant stepped forward. Joelle. She stopped. She had decided before she walked in that she would give him one moment. Not because she expected anything, but because the version of him she had once loved deserved a clean ending rather than a closed door. I needed to know what you would choose when you believed I had nothing left to offer you, she said. You gave me that answer yourself. I'm not angry about it anymore. She looked at him steadily with no performance in it. But I need you to understand that what you lost at Thornfield wasn't a settlement negotiation. It was a person who would have done anything for you. She walked out of the conference room without looking at Britta. What followed arrived in its proper order, piece by piece. The Ashby Development Board convened within the week. The compliance review produced findings that two of the independent directors said they could not responsibly set aside. The succession announcement was postponed. Grant resigned before the review concluded. Quietly, without a press statement, in the way people leave when they understand that staying will only extend the accounting. He vacated executive offices and the corporate apartment simultaneously. Several colleagues who had surrounded him for years stopped returning his calls within a month, which told him something about the nature of the alliances he had believed were personal. Burton contested the renovation invoices for 3 weeks, then stopped on the advice of Coleman, who had reviewed the documentation thoroughly enough to understand that continued public denial was the most expensive path available. The repayment became part of Ashby's settlement with Merit Capital. Thornfield remained theirs. It was private property, beyond the company's reach, but their name came off the buildings. Ashby Development's branding was updated quietly over the following year to reflect the new ownership structure, and the plaques that had carried Burton's name above the entrances of 4 Hartford properties were replaced without ceremony. Britta's expense records became part of the compliance documentation. She gave several interviews describing herself as having been misled about the nature of certain arrangements. The documentation did not support that account. Her professional reputation in the Hartford development community did not recover. Coleman, who had drafted the divorce settlement without realizing it protected everything Joelle owned from the family he worked for, withdrew from the Ashby family's representation once the scope of what the records contained became clear. He cooperated with the independent review. Harwick Tower broke ground on a clear morning in March, not with a private ceremony for board members, but with a public event attended by Hartford city officials, the project's engineering and construction teams, and Merit Capital's board. Joelle stood near the back and watched a woman named Ruthie Flores, 51-year-old foundation foreman with 22 years in Hartford construction, receive a small safety recognition award. Ruthie had nearly lost her benefits 14 months earlier when Ashby Development was hours away from collapse. She shook Joelle's hand at the end of the ceremony without knowing who Joelle was. She said she was glad the project was moving. She said her crew was ready. Joelle thanked her and meant it in a way she couldn't explain without telling the whole story, which she didn't need to do. That evening, in her father's old office above the Merit Capital Hartford space, a room with one photograph on the wall, Elias and a teenage Joelle at a job site in 1998, both wearing hard hats that were slightly too large, she signed the final Harwick Tower agreement and set the pen down. She did not feel victorious. Victory had never been the point. She felt the way her father had described feeling after completing something he had built honestly, quiet, and entirely like herself. Elias had told her once that power wasn't the ability to make people respect you. It was the ability to proceed without requiring it. To do the work, protect the people who depended on it, and trust that the truth would surface on its own schedule. She turned off the desk lamp and went home through streets she had driven for years without anyone knowing what she carried. Outside the office windows, the Hartford skyline sat steady under a clear March sky. Somewhere on that skyline, a foundation crew was finishing its first week of work on a building that would stand for 50 years. She had not needed anyone to see her hold it up. That had always been enough.